Good evening. Hello, I'm Karen Taylor. I'm Program Director of the General Society of the Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm so pleased to welcome you here to tonight's lecture, which is part of the Labour, Literature and Landmark Lecture Series and is our next spring 2021 Landmark Lecture. We would like to thank all of you attending this evening for your support of this lecture. We are so pleased to present this series of landmark lectures in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I would like to express our appreciation for their help and support. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785, 236 years ago, by 22 skilled craftsmen. Today, our organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. They include our lecture series, of which, of course, tonight's lecture is part of. It was originally founded in 1838. Our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John M. Mossman Lock Museum, and our 200-year-old library. At the conclusion of tonight's talk, there'll be a short 10 to 15-minute Q&A. Please feel free to submit Q&A questions throughout the lecture in the Q&A section. We ask that you use that rather than raising your hand or indeed the chat function. And of course, you could submit questions at the conclusion of the lecture. To introduce our speaker and the landmark lecture this evening, I am delighted to introduce the curator for the series, Lisa Easton, who's curated the series for the past 8 years. Lisa Easton is a partner in the New York-based architecture and historic preservation firm, Easton Architects. Lisa, delighted that you can be here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Over the past year, I've taken the opportunity to look at my community and the places familiar to me and really look and listen at what makes them special, familiar, interesting, and tangible. The built environment is enriched by the combination and coexistence of the new and the old, the exemplary and the ordinary, the riches of success and the struggles of poverty. Preservation provides the opportunity to listen and learn from the stories told by the buildings and the generations who have built and occupied them, which informs the sense of place that surrounds us. Preservation provides us with tangible objects that provide identity, memory, and continuity to ourselves, our communities, and our own personal history. It helps root us in our heritage. It develops unity and provides a spirit that helps define a neighborhood, a community, or a city. It establishes a timeline and it provides answers to the questions of time and place, rise and fall, riches and neglect. Preservation is not about being nostalgic. It's about living in a better present, that we are a part of a broader reach that connects eras, creates continuity, and embraces a more cumulative whole. And this is as important as the physical landmarks that represent our past and provide the foundation for our future. I'm honored to be a part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen's 2021 Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. Over the past 8 years of curating this lecture series, I've encountered extraordinary individuals who have helped shape our view of historic preservation. This year's Landmarks Lecture Series focuses on the landmarks with the small L that impact lives of different cultures, eras, and communities. Tonight, I'm proud to introduce our third lecturer in this year's series, Norma Barbacci. Norma is a preservation architect with over 30 years of experience in developing and managing preservation projects in Latin America, Spain, and Portugal. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from Carnegie Mellon University and her Master of Science in Historic Preservation from Columbia University. In 2020, Ms. Barbacci served as the Robert A.M. Stern Visiting Professor of Architecture at Yale University School of Architecture, and in 2017, she established Norma Barbacci Preservation Consultants, a private consulting firm specializing in preservation of international and cultural heritage. During her tenure as program director at the World Monuments Fund, she managed a portfolio of over 100 projects, which included envisioning and implementing comprehensive conservation and training programs at world-class monuments, such as Easter Island and the Alhambra. Tonight, Norma will share her thoughts on the preservation of cultural heritage. I look forward to the presentation, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Norma Barbacci.
Hello. Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. And I would like to share my screen to show my presentation. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen and the New York Landmarks Conservancy for this invitation. It's a pleasure to follow up on my husband's footsteps. He was a presenter a few years ago. So I hope I can do just as well, at least not disappoint. But anyway, thank you so much for the invitation. This lecture is more a little bit of my thoughts for the past 20 or so odd years, because about 20 years ago, I made a career change when I left Vernacular Architects and Planners to go to the World Monuments Fund, or WMF. Then I became the program director for Latin America, Spain, and Portugal. But at that time, when I made that career change, I did not think, I was not quite aware of it then, but over the years, I came to the realization that preservation overlapped with so many disciplines and fields. It touched so many aspects of our lives and has so many overlapping layers that it was more a way of life than a line of work. One of my first projects at WMF was the Jesuit Guarani mission of San Ignacio Mini in northern Argentina. The original project consisted of the conservation of a highly decorated Baroque portal that was part of the ruins of the town's church. However, immediately after my first visit to the site, it became obvious to me that in order to preserve the portal in a responsible way, we had to stabilize the rest of the structure of the church as well. Later on, and after several meetings with experts in conservation, archaeology, site management, and even nature conservation, I became convinced that saving the church without preserving and properly managing the whole Jesuit mission that surrounded it was also not enough. The church was a central element in the town's planning, but its reason for being was the 3,000 or sometimes 4,000 people, all Guarani, except for 2 or 3 Jesuit priests that lived and worked there. Therefore, in order to preserve the church in a sustainable way, one had to address the school, the houses, the workshops, and the public spaces where everyday life in a typical Jesuit mission unfolded. Now, a little bit of information about these missions for those who have not heard me talk about them for years. In the 17th and 18th centuries, over a period of about 150 years, the Jesuits created 30 towns or missions in a heavily forested area in South America that was once called Paraguaria. This area today expands over 4 countries: Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The Jesuits used innovative urban and architectural approaches to lay out their missions. They educated the previously nomadic groups of Guarani in art and music, and introduced an autonomous economic and social system through the organization of labor that provided for payment of their tribute to the King of Spain, while keeping the Guarani in their villages, and thus saving them from having to work as slaves in the encomiendas or work camps set up by the Spanish and the Portuguese. The profound knowledge of the land, as evidenced by the vast cartography produced by the Jesuits and the Guarani, the creation of important libraries in the villages, the development of handcrafts through high quality workshops, and the installation of the first printing press in the Southern Hemisphere all provide evidence of a far-reaching initiative. The economy of integrated complementarity, to quote historian Ramon Gutierrez, based on the need to respond organically to the requirements of the villages for food, clothing, and services, demanded of the Jesuits and the Guarani a system of apprenticeship that would result in the growth and self-sufficiency of the villages through development of cattle breeding and agriculture. This was something that the Spanish authorities did not quite understand, this type of system. They believed instead that their economic sustainability depended on each individual mission village as opposed to the system that they belonged to. And therefore, after the Jesuits were expelled in 1767, the mission system collapsed and the missions became ruins, slowly reclaimed by the jungle. As the project progressed, and the more I learned about the Jesuit missions, the more I believed we needed to address the entire system and its 30 towns, as well as the surrounding forest, and also the modern communities that formed around some of these sites. Thus, I started to become a believer in the concept of preservation as a global and all-encompassing pursuit. Preservation-minded actions probably date from time immemorial, but organized architectural conservation, understood as the conservation of historic architecture that includes rationalized documentation, restoration, and preservation, has its origins in the Italian Renaissance, from where by the mid-18th century spread to France, England, Germany, and Scandinavia, and everywhere else. It began as an upper-class concern focused on saving important monuments, but in time, less monumental, famous, or artistically significant examples would also be considered worth preserving. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century changed Europe's social structure and exploded urban populations, making its architects and historians increasingly aware of the value of the irreplaceable old buildings that had been inherited from the past. Some, like Sir Gilbert Scott and Viollet-le-Duc, chose a more aggressive restoration approach known as scrape, which espoused the correction of those mistakes or so-called mistakes made by preceding generations and they tried to regularize the decay, patina, and stylistic anarchy that normally reflected a building's history. But on the other hand, the followers of John Ruskin and William Morris criticized the former's heavy-handed restoration and favored a more sensitive conservation approach that emphasized the historic authenticity of buildings, which was known as anti-scrape. In the US, the first substantial architectural conservation effort occurred in the 19th century when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association fought to save George Washington's home in Virginia. Later, the preservation movement expanded to include historic enclaves and entire towns. And the last quarter of the 20th century saw a concern for the preservation of cultural legacies of the less privileged, such as serfs, slaves, farmers, etc. In 1945, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, was created with the task to protect the world's inheritance of books, works of art, and monuments of history and science. And in 1954, the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict was signed. National rebuilding in the aftermath of 2 world wars set the stage for the development of supported legislation for architectural conservation, such as the 1953 Historic Buildings and Ancient Monuments Act in England, or the Malraux Act of 1962 in France, or the 1966 Ancient Capitals Preservation Law in Japan, and the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 in the US. So the concept of heritage preservation got more complex, multi-layered, and internationalized, and saving a portal was not as simple anymore. From the early preservationist feud over authenticity to the more inclusive and participatory vision of the 21st century, preservation theory has embraced a variety of growing concerns through a series of international charters or manifestos, including integrity. The Athens Charter of 1931 was the first international document on general principles for the conservation and restoration of historical heritage. It promotes the departure from integral restitutions or stylistic restoration, and it values regular and permanent maintenance as the most effective measure in ensuring the conservation of monuments. It also promotes the sustained use of those monuments. The Athens Charter allows the practice of anastylosis and the insertion of new materials as long as they are recognizable. However, this assertion allowed for the introduction of modern materials in restoration, such as iron and concrete, which led to numerous debates on the negative effects caused by those materials in historic monuments. Another concern is authenticity. The Venice Charter of 1964 continues to be universally accepted for its rigor and clarity. One of its guiding principles is the preservation of authenticity as proposed by scientific restoration. It defends monumental as well as modest works, which through time have acquired cultural meaning. It considers the safeguard of the monument as a work of art as well as a historic document, and highlights the need to preserve in an integrated way, not only monumental sites, but also their environment. Another growing concern is tourism potential. The norms of Quito of 1967 promote the development of the tourism protection of potential of cultural sites and recognizes that archaeological, historic, and artistic monuments are economic resources and development tools that need to be protected and utilized as part of regional development plans. The interaction between culture and nature, or cultural and natural heritage. The 1972 World Heritage Convention, also known as the Paris Convention, is a structure developed by UNESCO, which defines the kind of natural or cultural sites that can be considered for inscription on the World Heritage List, and which offered for the first time a framework for collaboration between architectural conservators and conservation biologists. This convention also expanded the limited concept of cultural property to that of cultural heritage, which recognized cultural goods as symbolic objects rather than merely tradable commodities. Contemporary social values. The Charter of Nairobi of 1976 recommends that historic areas and their surroundings should be safeguarded and integrated into contemporary social life, and should be considered as a whole composed of human activities as much as buildings. In that sense, the preservation of historic areas can contribute to maintaining and developing the cultural and social values of each nation and the architectural enrichment of the cultural heritage of the world. Cultural values. The Burra Charter of 1979 is particularly important for its definition of cultural significance and the standards for using cultural significance to manage and conserve cultural sites. It advocates a cautious approach to change. Do as much as necessary to care for the place and to make it usable, but otherwise change it as little as possible so that its cultural significance is retained. In urban values, the Washington Charter of 1987 advocates for the conservation of historic towns and urban areas as an integral part of policies of economic and social development and of urban and regional planning at every level. Qualities to be preserved include the historic character of the towns and all those material and spiritual elements that express his character, such as urban patterns, relationships between buildings and open spaces, formal appearance of buildings as defined by scale, size, style, construction, materials, etc., relationship between the town and its surrounding setting, both natural and man-made, and various functions that the town has acquired over time. Cultural diversity. The 1994 NARA Charter accepts the principle of cultural diversity in the creation of heritage values, which implies an opening or a change in the interpretation of international charters as concerns the conservation of cultural heritage. Therefore, judgments of values and authenticity should not be based on one fixed criteria. On the contrary, the respect due to all cultures require that heritage properties must be considered and judged within the cultural context to which they belong. And Vernacular Architecture, in 1999, the Charter of the Built Vernacular Heritage recognizes it as an integral part of the cultural landscape, and that it embraces not only the physical form and fabric of buildings, structures and spaces, but also the ways in which they are used and understood, and the traditions and the intangible associations attached to them. And historic urban landscapes, the 2005 Vienna Memorandum proposes that the continuous socio-economical changes that transform the historic urban landscape are acknowledged as part of the city's tradition and require a holistic vision of the city on the part of decision makers, and a dialogue with other actors and stakeholders involved as well. So physical and functional interventions should enhance the quality of life by improving living, working, and recreational conditions and adapting uses without compromising existing values derived from the character and significance of the historic urban fabric. More recently, concepts of living heritage and the connections between tangible and intangible heritage, as well as decolonizing heritage, which was a central theme in the 2019 ICROM General Assembly. Decolonizing is about difficult conversations and reflections on the meaning of cultural institutions and who these institutions are intended to serve. It is about open and true dialogue with all members of communities and society. It is about sharing power and authority. So World Monuments Fund went through its own evolution since its establishment in 1965 as the first private international organization dedicated to the safeguard of the world's built heritage. Its first initiatives attempted to save the art and palaces of Venice from seasonal floods and the stone churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, as well as the iconic Moai of Easter Island from erosion, without necessarily, at that time, addressing their social context, cultural identity issues, or the sustainability of the interventions, for that matter. But it is worth mentioning that decades later, WMF returned to Venice, Lalibela, and Easter Island with a much more comprehensive approach to the preservation of these sites, which by then had been inscribed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites in 1987, 78, and 95, respectively. In the late 1980s, when the Khmer Rouge was in retreat, WMF started its work in Angkor, the iconic Khmer capital in Cambodia. And this project, which still continues, represented a fundamental change in the organization. Decades of chaos and genocide caused by the Khmer Rouge insurgency had decimated Cambodia's professional class, and the country needed a new generation of stewards. So it was not enough to restore or rebuild the monuments, but it was also necessary to create local capacity from the ground up to guarantee their long-term preservation. Since then, training in traditional construction and conservation became one of the most important pillars of WMF's mission. Today, Angkor Archaeological Park is the most visited heritage site in the country, and hundreds of Cambodians work there to safeguard this World Heritage Site. The conservation work is important because of its historic and cultural value, but it also represents a great symbol of the rebirth of the country after a dark period. In addition, it contributes to the national economy and the lives of the Cambodians who work as engineers, architects, archaeologists, conservators, guides, and guards, all deriving income from their work. Here, I would like to bring up Jane Jacobs and her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, written 60 years ago in 1961, a landmark in architectural conservation literature, where she argued that urban renewal did not respect the needs of city dwellers. Her arguments helped persuade public officials and developers to respond to popular demands for preservation. Jacobs organized grassroots efforts to protect neighborhoods from slum clearance. In particular, Robert Moses' plans to overhaul her own Greenwich Village neighborhood. She was instrumental in the eventual cancellation of the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have passed right through Soho and Little Italy. I should also mention James Marston Fitch, who played a major role in the historic preservation movement in the 1960s in the United States. In his first book, written in 1948, American Building and the Forces That Shape It, he drew connections between architecture and climate. And in 1964, Fitch was one of the founders of the Historic Preservation Program at Columbia University. Under Fitch's training, a preservationist would be educated in all areas that affect architecture, not only history and conservation, but also politics and real estate. Emphasis was placed on community efforts as opposed to narrow and isolated special interest projects, thereby building a social conscience. Upon his death, Jane Jacobs told the New York Times that Fitch was the principal character in making the preservation of historic buildings practical and feasible and popular. Now, returning to War Monuments Fund, its next evolutionary change came in 1996 with establishment of the World Monuments Watch program. The Watch program was originally established as a call for attention to imperiled cultural heritage around the world through a biennial publication of a list of 100 most endangered sites. Through this program, WMF began to expand its portfolio of monumental sites to include sites of sometimes mainly local importance, such as Herschel Island, a whaling settlement in Canada, or Miss Lassie's Mind's Eye, which was a modest artist home in the Cayman Islands. Vernacular architecture, like the traditional Burmese teak farmhouses, or the Huaca historic neighborhood in Veracruz, Mexico. It also included urban complexes, like the historic centers of Lima and Mexico, cultural landscapes, like the ancient rich fields of the San Jorge River in Colombia, or the transhumance cultural landscape in Italy. Transhumance was the seasonal moving of sheep across grazing lands. Also, utilitarian architecture, such as Scott's Hut in Antarctica, monuments of social justice, like the Alabama civil rights sites in the US, or symbols of a dark legacy, such as Perm 36, a Gulag prison camp in Russia. The watch list sometimes mixed world-renowned monuments and as well as local relics in the same listing, such as in 2002, when the Great Wall of China and the tiny adobe chapel of San Pedro in a very small and remote town of Morrote, Peru, made the list. And in the past couple of decades, many War Monuments Fund projects began to be integrated into broader initiatives that included capacity building and training, as in Cambodia, such as the Huaca de la Luna, the ancient Moche capital in Trujillo, Peru, or the Casa de las Columnas, which is a residential complex restored by students of the Escuela Taller or Craft School in Lima, or the churches of Arica and Parinacota, restored as part of a conservation and seismic retrofit training program in northern Chile. Others supported integrated nature and culture planning, as in the archaeological Maya sites of Yaxchilán in Mexico and Piedras Negras in Guatemala, as well as the fortifications of San Lorenzo and Portobello in Panama. Other projects embrace community participation, as with the development of the site redevelopment plan for Orongo, an archaeological site in Easter Island, as well as long-term regional planning, as in the development of a management plan for the archaeological site of Chanquillo in Peru. But finally, the most comprehensive project I worked on at WMF included the conservation and structural stabilization of the Baroque church of San Pedro de Andawalias, dating from 1570, completed in 1606, located in Cusco, Peru. This church, and you can see from the interior painting, was considered the Sistine Chapel of the Andes. The project also included the cataloging of its artistic collection and a 3-year youth heritage program aimed at promoting interest among the local youth, encouraging them to explore the works of their ancestors and providing them with the skills and opportunities to enable them to become actively involved in the protection, interpretation, and promotion of their cultural heritage. We also were instrumental in working with the Ministry of Culture in actually landmarking the town so it would be protected from indiscriminate interventions. But after leaving WMF in 2017, I established an independent heritage consulting firm, and my first client was the Inter-American Development Bank. IDB's urban preservation projects must pass through the filter of financial sustainability, and despite including a philanthropic component in the form of technical support, they are investment projects that must guarantee a reasonable return on the invested capital and the repayment of their loans. Through my work with IDB, I revisited an early WMF project, the fortifications of Panama, which had received originally, through WMF, an American Express grant for conservation and planning work. But in this opportunity, we had to develop a participatory plan for community development in the historic town of Portobello. The purpose of such plan was to make sure the restoration of the forts to be financed by the IDB loan had a positive impact on the town by providing economic and educational opportunities to the local community. In Suriname, another IDB project I worked on, the loan's purpose was to address the depopulation and decline of quality of life in the historic center of Paramaribo, a World Heritage Site. The mechanism proposed include revitalizing the historic center using preservation as a catalyst for economic and social progress, triggering private investment and attracting new residents and businesses. For me, these projects were a departure from the philanthropy center experience of preservation at War Monuments Fund towards considering preservation from an investment point of view. Advocates like Jane Jacobs defended the preservation of neighborhoods that develop organically and where old and new buildings coexisted harmoniously to provide the fabric or the glue that held socially and ethnically mixed communities together. Many of those preserved neighborhoods became highly sought after places to live. They attracted investment and its property values increased, which of course benefited local owners. However, gentrification and its negative aspects including segregation, displacement, and loss of traditional neighborhood uses has also been a result of urban rehabilitation. Although I do not have answers to this problem, I believe that ideally, historic neighborhoods, their communities and their traditional uses should be preventively conserved or maintained, so there is no need to later restore or rehabilitate them, to quote architectural preservation terms. Historic structures and neighborhoods are non-renewable resources that carry cultural, aesthetic, social, or political values, which may outweigh their economic value, but it is the economic and increasingly the environmental implications of preserving and reusing versus demolishing and building new, the elements of preservation that have the highest impact on the sustainability of those resources. It is no accident that the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, or SDGs, include the strengthening the efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage as target number 4 of their goal number 11, which proposes to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, along with goals like poverty relief, gender equality, social inclusion, and conservation of the environment. The economics of preservation as a study subject has grown substantially, and the availability of research demonstrating the economic benefits of preserving and reusing old structures has increased dramatically in recent decades. Although this body of knowledge is better known and applied in the global north, it sadly remains little known outside expert circles or throughout the global south. One initiative that is trying to change that is the Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance, or CHIFA, a nonprofit organization established a year ago by Bonnie Burnham, the former president of War Monuments Fund. Upon leaving War Monuments Fund after 30 years at the helm of the institution, Bonnie believed that the paradigm of the preservation of cultural heritage had to adapt through the adoption of a new financial model that involved private investment, complementing public financing and philanthropy. A year ago, Bonnie asked me to help her identify possible pilot projects in Latin America, as well as case studies that demonstrated good practices in urban rehabilitation based on this type of blended financing. One of the cases we documented was the rehabilitation of the historic center of Mexico. At the end of the 20th century, despite its World Heritage status and the extraordinary quality of its monuments, the living conditions in the historic center of Mexico were dire. Crime, traffic, poor air quality, and the proliferation of street vendors contributed to the decline of the area, which actually started in the 1950s when UNAM, or the National Autonomous University of Mexico, moved out of the historic center. This situation reached its lowest point in the aftermath of the 1985 earthquakes that destroyed 400 buildings in the historic center and damaged thousands more in the cities. There were several attempts to revert the deterioration of the historic center in the 1980s and 90s, but the turning point really came in 2001 when Carlos Slim, the Mexican businessman, at one point the richest and currently the fourth richest person in the world, Vicente Fox, the then president of Mexico, and Andrés López Obrador, then mayor of Mexico City, they all agreed to join forces and launch a coordinated action plan that resulted in a completely revitalized historic center, and at the same time generated important financial benefits for all the private sector entrepreneurs who invested in its recovery. The duality of public and private investment and philanthropy resulted in significant impacts, all coordinated by a plan elaborated by a large group of intellectual leaders with Slim at the helm. All sectors of society were involved, and the sustained political leadership and commitment, together with a dynamic private engagement and extensive social programs, were sort of the secret sauce of the success of this initiative. Without the private sector investing, pacing the public investment, it is very unlikely that any of the positive outcomes would have come about. The continuity of the rehabilitation efforts from the establishment of the Council of the Historic Center in the 1980s through the private trust or fideicomiso created in the 1990s, and the sustained public support and private investments from 2001 to date, have created a tradition of cooperation for urban regeneration unparalleled in Latin America, which continues to bear fruit. So what's next? Currently, historic preservation is a global concern that engages broad segments of society and has become an independent field with many areas of interest, including architecture, conservation science, museology, education, urban planning, tourism, sustainability, economics, climate science, etc. And while the concepts of heritage and the tools used for its preservation have evolved, the 21st century is witnessing new or intensified threats. The planet's built and natural environments are undergoing dramatic transformations through globalization, armed conflict, and mass migration, which are reshaping cities, towns, and human settlements, causing great upheaval. In this context, the erosion of heritage sites, the loss of traditions, and the divestment of historic centers are occurring at an alarming and accelerating rate. The need to secure additional resources for the preservation of cultural heritage is seen throughout the world as public budgets for culture decline, which shows that culture continues to play a peripheral role within public policies in most countries. Traditionally, especially outside the US, governments at the national, regional, and municipal levels have been relied upon for the management of cultural assets, including financing for their conservation and public use, while the private sector has been called upon to fill financial gaps through philanthropy. This management system is not sustainable since the availability of funding, public funding for culture cannot keep up with the increasing numbers of designated properties and protected sites. This situation became particularly difficult in Mexico when the current government slashed the annual budget of the National Institute of Anthropology and History, INA, which is the institution in charge of the preservation of all archaeological sites in the country, by 75% in 2020. And all of this was happening before we were hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which brought along an unprecedented global crisis that affected our lives, our livelihoods, and the social and cultural fabric of our society. COVID also impacted our material and intangible heritage through the diversion of financial resources to more pressing needs, such as health and prevention, closing of sites and museums, and canceling of all live cultural events, lack of accessibility to carry out preventive conservation, and the worst of all, for many sites, the end of tourism. Finally, if we consider the saying, never let a good crisis go to waste, whether by Winston Churchill, Albert Einstein, or Rahm Emanuel, is useful advice, we should be thinking about how preservation can continue evolving to better serve a post-pandemic world in which the rampant inequality and racism laid bare by the COVID crisis cannot be ignored anymore. As preservationists and as human beings for that matter, I think we should take on the responsibility to be more concerned about the less fortunate, or to use preservation to support a better quality of life for all, and to advocate for nature and the environment. So whether we're working to save a portal, a church, a town, or an ecosystem, we should keep in mind that our choices matter and that all voices are important. Thank you for listening.
Norma, thank you so very much. That was such a comprehensive overview of the evolution of cultural heritage, and you raised so many interesting points. We will now open up the Q&A. And I would ask, I think a couple of people have raised their hands, and I'm so sorry, but could I ask you, rather than raising your hand, if you wouldn't mind typing your question in. And I am going to take, okay, this is a question from Richard Massa. And his, he wonders, Norma, what is your opinion of the proposed intervention of the new platform to be inserted into the Roman Colosseum?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not that familiar with the exact proposal, but yes, I read about it. And what I would say, I mean, it's part of the evolution of sites. And I mentioned at one point that sites are also, you know, a tourism resource. And that's the way the managers of the Colosseum are looking at it. And I would say, you know, from the preservation point of view, you would say, obviously, you have to take care and be careful with interventions that could damage not only the building, but also the cultural values associated with them. And I would say, well, in that case, they probably evaluated the weight of the importance of their tourism value and the interpretation values, because they want, if I understood correctly, they want people to actually experience the Roman Colosseum the way the gladiators or the early, you know, Romans experienced it. So it could be, there could be an argument for doing that intervention from the point of view of recreating sort of like an intangible aspect of the Colosseum that has been lost through centuries of being a ruin. So, but I really don't know enough about that particular intervention to say, well, maybe they should have done something a little bit, you know, less impactful or different. But I could see, you know, why they would be looking at that as an opportunity for recreating something that was lost.
And I think as you've as you just indicated, I mean, tourism itself is a mixed blessing for cultural heritage, isn't it? Because there's obviously the impact of the tourists, but yet there, of course, is the financial contributions they bring to countries, to the specific sites. It's, you know, it's a balancing act, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, tourism is I mentioned, you know, many sites were affected by the COVID pandemic because tourism stopped and they lost all of their potential sources of income. But yes, it is a double-edged sword. I mean, some sites could be completely destroyed because of unmanaged or uncontrolled tourism. I mean, Venice, for one example, I mean, the Venetians were moving out of the city. They were like it was a city for tourists and not so much for the local inhabitants. So that's a sort of like a dramatic example. Also, there are places, I mean, even Cusco, you know, the historic center of Cusco in Peru is being affected greatly by the over tourism, to the point that it's actually threatening the social structure of the Cusqueños, and so on. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about tourism, but I think there are also benefits that could be drawn from it. And it's all a matter, like you said, it's a balancing act, but it's also has to do with proper planning and integrated planning, you know. So it's not just the tourism people guiding the discussion, it's that you have to have culture representatives from different social groups and so on. So it has to be, you know, a concerted effort. So tourism is just one more element in the fight, you know, or in the purpose of protecting and preserving sites, but it doesn't overwhelm them.
Thank you for answering that. We have a question from Abby Heller, and she thanked you for your illuminating lecture, and she makes the point it is encouraging that these historic sites are maintained, protected, preserved. If the physical and the utility of a building, social, cultural, should be the optimum objective in preservation, why are there so many historic sites that do not conform to that practicality? And shall I go on? She asked a question related to that, or do you want to address that first?
I'm not sure I quite got it. It's incredible. You know, I see it written, it says should impress social and cultural. Yeah, that do not conform to that practicality.
Yeah, and is one of the reasons that they fall into despair, is it relics or oblivion? And also, why is there so much resistance to blending historic places and creating new buildings within the neighborhood community?
Yeah, I mean, and it's part of the growth. I mean, it's like historic, especially in historic centers, towns, is so much more complicated to deal with, you know, and try to preserve with something that is still alive and functioning, as opposed to preserving either an archaeological site or a single monument. When we're talking about historic centers that were actually historic cities, I mean, right now we call them as if they are a separate part of the city, but they were actually the city, you know, when the cities started. But yes, because there's people living there, there are uses, some uses are traditional, new uses are coming in, therefore new infrastructure, new buildings need to come in. And again, it's part of this balancing act where, and as Jane Jacobs proposed, you know, this combination of historic resources with new buildings and new resources in a balanced and sort of like a respectful way, they're usually much more successful than you know, massive urban renewal proposals where large swaths of historic areas are removed for creating, you know, something new. You know, this kind of organic growth and careful planning, and I think a very big fan of participatory planning, even though it's much more complicated and messy. But at the end, listening to all these different voices is actually very helpful in reaching this type of, balanced act of preservation.
Thank you. The next question, this is from Noah and Louisa Pelletieri, and they'd love to get your advice on how to preserve the stone carving tradition, which has almost been killed by mechanization. And they make the very valid point. It seems to be an important aspect of preservation of ancient buildings. And they also thank you for your lecture, your excellent lecture.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, I don't know, I don't have an answer, but I know where it's coming from. I mean, a lot of these trades were lost, especially in the US, because buildings were, buildings that require this type of trade or preservation of this type of trade or elements were not, maintained. So there was not a big need for stone carving, except, I mean, places like the National Cathedral that kept so many stonemasons, and including, my husband's, one of his first partner in business was a stone carver from the National Cathedral, or St. John the Divine, which was another area, another building that actually had a program that tried to preserve stone carving through the completion of St. John the Divine. So it's like you need to have it's like in any market, you need to have a demand in order to, call for having people trained in order to supply that demand. And if you don't have it, you lose it. In Europe, for example, I believe, I mean, I'm no expert, but the tradition of stone carving or certain trades had been maintained for a lot longer than here in the US. I think I've heard that being attributed to the fact that a lot of for example, the French tendencies are more to restore, let's say, le violet, le doux kind of approach, where you replace a stone, a carved stone, so therefore you maintain the trade, as opposed to in the US and Italy, where we have a much more conservative approach, which is you try to save and you conserve that piece, but you don't carve the new one. But I'm not sure if that used to be what we discussed when we were in school, but I really don't know what the situation with those trades are right now.
So, I mean, what you said before, I mean, there's certainly a lot to be pessimistic about, and for instance, like, in the terms of like, as you said, the environment, armed conflict, governments who don't care, all those things. But there's also a great deal of hope, isn't there? Because of all like these initiatives that you so clearly outlined that have happened. And I suppose it's just sometimes for countries make cultural heritage a lower priority than they need to. What else, what other causes do you see for optimism, including something that you mentioned, participatory planning is something that obviously works well?
Well, I could mention one very specific cause for optimism, at least in my small world. It's like I'm working on a project right now in Peru, and it's funded by the European Union. And it's the main focus of that whole project is to promote and facilitate private participation in the conservation or the protection of cultural heritage. Like I mentioned before in part of my lecture, was that a lot of countries, not so much the US, but outside of the US, where the governments are relied upon to take care, not only regulate, but also invest in the preservation of their cultural sites. So the private sector is just sitting back, and maybe there is some philanthropy, but they're just sitting back and waiting for someone, for the government to take care of this sites. They don't really, they see preservation more as a problem than as, let's say, as an asset, But that could be changed. I mean, it could be changed through changing attitudes, through more demonstration projects. And in the particular case of Lima, where I'm working on right now, through regulation and changing the current preservation laws that are so onerous, and they make the act of preservation or the act of investment in the saving, reusing a historic building so complicated that it just really don't have to be like that. So they are, in a way, their measures are very counterproductive, you know, and instead, you know, they're making people afraid of investing or buying historic properties because that is so restrictive. So part of our work right now, we're doing seminars and workshops to try to explain to people, you know, like with the example of Mexico, that this is not, you know, it's not a European or a US based initiative. It happens. This private and public partnership is actually very viable in our own context, meaning Latin America or, you know, global South. There are examples that can be done. So that would be on the positive side. But basically what we need is more, you know, open minds to sort of change this way of thinking. So.
And do you think that something like the World Monuments Fund, if there was like on a larger scale, is that something that could be transformative if that was possible?
Would be amazing. I mean, there should be like 100 World Monuments Fund, you know. It's like there is enough work for organizations like that, and WMF is pretty unique in that sense. You know, there's not that many. I mean, there's UNESCO, but they don't fund projects and so on and so forth. So this type of organization is very useful. However, you know, like I mentioned before, the initiative that Bonnie Burnham is proposing is not based in philanthropy. It's based on recognizing this economic value of saving or preserving heritage and using it, you know, as an engine for development and economic growth and improving quality of life of different communities. So it's not a new concept. It's not something that nobody has ever thought about it, but it's a way of just kind of changing this vision or changing the attitude that people are having, you know, towards heritage or something that needs to be treated as a museum piece. It's like, yes, of course, it needs to be preserved, but also needs to be useful. Otherwise, right, nobody's going to want to, you know, there's no budget or reasonable way of preserving it otherwise.
Thank you, Norma. This will be our last question. This is from Amisha Hunter, and she thanks you for your outstanding lecture. You pointed out the issue of financial sustainability, participatory planning, and capacity building for preservation efforts. What are your thoughts about how well these fundamental concepts are integrated into academic training of preservation professionals in the US? What a great question. Yeah.
It is great. You know, unfortunately for me, I went to school a very, very long time ago. So I really couldn't speak, you know, knowledgeably about what the current situation is with the academic training in preservation. But I could speak from my own training at Columbia, which was, yeah, you know, it was something that we looked at so many different aspects. I mean, I was in the design option of the program, but we were looking at history, at conservation. We were looking at planning, which was, you know, obviously a very important tool. And our work had to do with neighborhoods and projects within New York City. So I would say, based on my experience, you know, it was a good kind of balanced, mixed experience, but I could not speak about like the current situation of, you know, the academic field in preservation.
Right, right. Well, something that it seems like that would be absolutely critical to be addressing in the, for instance, like the historic preservation course at Columbia, for instance. I mean, I know there are many others, but I suppose I'm perhaps more familiar with that one. So Norma, I just want to say, I'm going to read out, we had a comment from Vivian Topp, and I think she just sort of summed it up so well. So she thanked you so much. An incredible lecture, so well organized and easy to understand, even though there was, you know, extensive information. And that is so true. You took, you know, a complicated a topic, and you just outlined it so clearly, and it was just like to see, to see the initiatives in a chronological order, and the wonderful images that you use to support what you were discussing. And it really was, I'm going to quote from you, it was, it really was about a broader and more inclusive vision. And I think you just delivered that so eloquently tonight. So Norma, thank you so very much. And we so appreciate you being part of our landmark lectures. And we hope, as with all our future lecturers who have perhaps not been to the General Society before, that we have an opportunity to welcome you in person. And with that, I'm just going to mention a couple of upcoming events that are audience tonight. And I want to thank you, the audience. We so appreciate you being here and participating this evening. Next week, we have a lecture, that's Tuesday, June the 1st, Walking Manhattan Sideways. And this is about the businesses, the stores, the bars, the quirky shops that you find in the side streets. And this is about someone who's kind of traversed this and has produced a book about it. And it should be, it should be absolutely fascinating. Tuesday, June 15th, we have the art historian Sharon Suchma, her topic is In and Out of the Hand, Mechanisms of Art. And that will be an insightful look at tools, symbols, and mechanisms featured in art throughout the centuries. On Tuesday, June 22nd, we have another landmark lecture, and that is the impact and possibilities of preservation, lessons from the Neighborhood Preservation Center with Felicia Mero. And Felicia will be very much talking about the community interaction there. And for the final lecture of June, we're just delighted that we're going to have Nick Leahy, who's the co-CEO and executive director of Perkins Eastman, and he's going to talk about the renovation of the Tenement Museum, and that is Tuesday, June 29th. And if I didn't mention Felicia's, it's Tuesday, June 22nd. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Norma, I want to thank you again. That was just fantastic. It was absolutely wonderful, and what a wonderful contribution and addition to the landmark lectures. So with that, I'm going to say good night. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks. Good night.